Hi everyone, I am Mahammad Mammadov, a research fellow at the Topchubashov Center. Today we continue our TopTalk video series on geopolitical developments in the wider Eurasian region. And in this episode we will discuss implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine for the geopolitical and geoeconomic developments in Central Asia. My guest is Francisco Olmos. Fran is a research fellow covering Central Asia at the Foreign Policy Center, a nonpartisan international affairs think tank based in the UK, and he is a main researcher on the post-Soviet space at Geopol. So, dear Fran, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and joining our program.
Sure.
So let's start with a bit more general question. Which I recently discussed with some researchers specializing in Central Asian affairs. I also want to ask you this question: that how Russia's growing isolation in the international arena after its invasion of Ukraine affected its relations with Central Asian countries, both in economic and political terms.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the Russia Central Asia, they prior to the invasion, and still in the present time, they have very strong links, very strong economic links, trade links, political links. I mean, that's no secret. It happened. They were part of the Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union broke up, those links were still there. From an economical point of view, we see that of course both parties, the Central countries and Russia, are still very close. Some of the Central Asian countries still depend on Russia to a large extent for their exports. And I'm talking here, for instance, about Kazakhstan's oil exports to the west, whose pipeline crosses Russia. So we've seen here, for instance, for Kazakhstan, because we could speak as a region as a whole, but I think it's important to highlight the different countries because they all have different relations vis-a-vis Russia and have been impacted differently. In the Kazakh case, we have seen their exports to the west oil being impacted by the war. This is the pipeline that crosses western Kazakhstan into Russia and then into the Black Sea. And throughout last year, this pipeline has been interrupted 3 times by Russia, citing technical reasons. But what sits behind that is messages to Kazakhstan's government, depending on their positioning on the Ukraine conflict. So we have seen, for instance, that impact on the economy. And of course, there's the sanctions aspect that this country tried to comply with to some extent, especially again Kazakhstan. But they're trying to balance, comply with the sanctions, but again giving way to still maintaining those links to Russia. Then from a let's say transport point of view, will be evident as the time goes by. The Central countries, again, especially Kazakhstan, but not only, are transit from Asia, from Eastern Asia to Europe, instead of going through Russia. Well, there's talks about this middle corridor, so they're more by the. And there's other routes also, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Iran. So they're also becoming an important transit hub, which historically they've always been, but this has been highlighted during the invasion. Then we have an important aspect, which is the Putin has been quite active this last year in 2022, meeting with all the Central Asian leaders, all 5 countries, something which hadn't happened in a while. So trying to become isolated, and again, these countries they will welcome Putin. Russia's gonna increase their purchases, right? So that's a way of doing it. And then we have also a social aspect, which has been the mobilization in Russia, where we have seen hundreds of thousands of Russians pass through Kyrgyzstan. Like as they pass, because most of them left the countries through other destinations, but a number of still states. So that's also put a bit of a strain locally in terms of resources. But it's always also shown that Kazakhstan is open to a large extent to this Russian mobilization. Let's put it this way. So it's been quite an eventful year in terms of Russia-Central Asian relations as a result of the war. They've been impacted, of course, and we at a political level also the United Nations, where Central Asian countries normally never voted against Russia. The different resolutions, either not themselves in favor of Russia, but again not against. So they're mostly balancing act Russia's foreign policy, and again with the countries in order not to upset a global order, we could say.
Yeah, it will be maybe a bit a weird question, but what do you think? What a regime collapse in Russia would mean for Central Asia?
Well, if that were to happen, and this is a hypothesis, as you say, it's hard to understand if the regime collapses. The implications. I mean, the country most affected probably would be to some extent Kazakhstan. I mean, they share more than 7,000 kilometers in terms of border. They have very strong also political links between the leads. So, I mean, one would expect again, but and potentially we don't know if there could be instability in the border. I mean, so far that hasn't happened, but it depends of the regime that comes next, how nationalist it is. I mean, we've seen in the past nationalist remarks, irredentist remarks from most, even from Putin, questioning Kazakhstan statehood and reclaiming part of its territory. So we don't know that look like. And then Tajikistan, for instance, would also be affected, right? I mean, they have big Russian base there, regime. So I mean, again, if there's a regime change in Moscow, and it depends who comes, let's see what policy they would have towards Tajikistan. But I mean, as a whole, the country would be affected because the political aspect would change definitely, but we don't know. I mean, this is a bit hard to answer because this is a relation. But yeah, I mean, definitely the region would be impacted to a large extent.
Yeah, exactly. So if we are talking about Russia's, I mean, changing dynamics in Russia, Central Asia relations, I think we should also touch upon the role of China, because after the sanctions regime on Russia, we saw Russia's, let's say, pivot to the east, where China and India played major roles, and we apparently saw China's increasing leverage, both economic, I think, and political, over Moscow. And at the same time, in parallel, we see China's increasing economic footprint in the Central Asian countries. So what do you think? What does it mean for China's future position in the Central Asia? Because before there was such an understanding that Russia was, let's say, the major security actor in the region, and China mostly economic, and there was such kind of a gentleman agreement, let's say. Can it mean that China's security presence in the region will also increase?
I mean, so far, like you just mentioned, the stereotypical way of putting it was that Russia was the soldier, and China was the banker, the commercial partner. Now the security footprint of China in Central Asia is limited, mostly present in Tajikistan through a the country, Chinese and Afghan border. They're financing another frontier post on the other side of the Wakhan corridor, although they say it's going to be manned by troops here. But so far what we have seen is Chinese presence in the region in terms of security is related to its own security concerns. In this case, regarding Afghanistan, right? China has a border with Afghanistan, but also shares a border with Afghanistan. So far, its concern in the region has been related to preventing an instability from Afghanistan reaching China via Tajikistan, for instance, right? So that's been the main concern. Then, of course, there's been some minor weapon exports by China, so drones and other equipment, and counterterrorism exercises have been taken of the SEO. China expanding itself greatly in terms of security. I mean, probably, it's going to be a bit more present in the coming years. But if what has happened in the past shows something, that Chinese priorities are trade and the economy rather than, establishing more ties with this international country. So from this perspective, Russia, that has Uzbekistan, then also one in Kyrgyzstan and so on, I think will still remain the major security partner of the region. But of course, probably after the war, during the war, I mean, its presence has been diminished, also in the number of troops. There are reports, some of them from Central Asia have been sent to Ukraine and so on and so forth.
Yeah, talking about the Russia's and Chinese roles, I would also like to touch upon the role of the, let's say, domestic factors, like the role of elites. And do we see any kind of changes in the, let's say, elite struggles in these countries after let's say, Russia's weakness, because Russia had some linkages to the power, let's say, games in these countries? And so lastly, we saw the end of the father of nation, let's say, era in Kazakhstan. But on the contrary, most recently we saw Mr. Berdi Mammadov was back, let's say, as the head of. So what are the main drivers behind it? Of course, there are some certain domestic issues, but are there any, let's say, impact of Russia's, let's say, weakness on these issues, or?
I mean, of course, it's this sort of things are hard to know because they don't happen publicly. But I think Russia still plays an important role in terms of the elite relationships with the different situation countries. I mean, you mentioned the Kazakh case. I mean, Tokayev established his power a year ago, and it's been quite critical of Russia, but at the same time, hasn't opened totally with Russia, of course, because that would be not possible, and that wouldn't be in their interest. Now it's still sort of trying to keep things so policy, maintaining good relations with its neighbors. In the Turkmen case, I mean, you mentioned about this sort of transition of power to the son, but now it's back to the father in other changes that happened in early this year, and we have seen lots of trips from different Russian officials to Turkmenistan in the last year, more than usual. So I mean, you could still tell that there's still a strong links between the elites, and then we can also put it specifically also in Putin and the Turkmen regime. So I don't think the war has had an impact in that aspect. As far as we can see, those relationships are still there. Probably in the case of Russia and Turkmenistan, probably even stronger than prior to the war. It looks like Russia doesn't want Turkmenistan to let go, and the Turkmen regime, I guess it's happy to continue collaborating with Russia and getting funds in terms of selling more gas to Russia and infrastructure projects and so on. So we haven't seen a major change because of the war. Again, it's a topic that it's hard to know in the short term because it's not a very open and public one. But we cannot see other things have changed because of the war. This one I would take with a pinch of salt and probably say that not much has changed in some countries. Even the relationship has got stronger.
Yeah. So what about the role of the, let's say, third powers in the Central Asian affairs, which, I mean, I actually read your article about the drone aids, or in Central Asian, let's say, geopolitics, and where Turkey and Iran featured highly on the discussion. So how do you think, how will it affect the security situation in the region?
Well, I mean, one of the, let's say, players that it's, having an impact lately is Turkey. I mean, Turkey has always been sort of present in the region, but distant to China, mostly due to financial reasons. Now, to some extent, some Asian countries, Turkey to diversify policy. We have seen the growing role that Turkey wants the Organization of Turkic States to play, although its impact has been quite limited. From a security perspective, we have seen an increase of Turkish arms exports to the region, mostly drones, like you mentioned. We can tell now 3 out of the 5 Central Asian countries will be equipped to some extent with Turkish drones. For Kyrgyzstan, it's going to be most of their arsenal. Then Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan will have some drones in their arsenal made in Turkey. But it's not only specific to drones, right? Throughout the last decade, they've been exporting armed vehicles, smaller weapons. They've armed most of Turkmenistan's new navy, so to speak. So, I mean, it's an interesting market from the Turkish perspective to export their weapons. Now, is that going to have an impact in terms of the security? I mean, in the region, I don't think that's going to, create major differences. I mean, it's just countries need to arm themselves with the latest weapons. They look for different suppliers, and some of them for political, financial, turning to weapons. Iran's role here is much more limited in terms of security. It's been mostly related to Tajik, establishing a factory of drones there in last spring, but we have not seen the footprint that Turkey has had in terms of the countries. Like I said, it's mostly related to this drone factory in Tajikistan. So I mean, Iran plays an important role in other aspects in terms of transit, providing transit, from Central Asia to Asia, Middle East, or Europe through its territory and its ports. But from a point of view, as things stand right now, they're quite a distant position to Turkey and of course other players like China.
Yeah, and lastly, I would like to ask you about the prospects of the interregional cooperation. When we talk about the Central Asian countries, let's say multi-vector foreign policy, some of them, it's mostly about their relations with different major power poles in the region. Yeah, China, Turkey, mainly Russia. What about the prospects of the interregional cooperation? Can Russia's weakness play a role in it, or?
Well, I don't know if it's Russia weaknesses like you mentioned can force encourage what is true is regardless. It's currently happening to some extent, especially we compare Central Asia in the last years. This is mostly, I mean, again, we should the region as a whole here because different countries are doing this differently or are not doing it at all. But the most important case is Uzbekistan, probably since Mirziyoyev came to power almost 7 years. And before, during Karimov's regime, it was quite unwilling to cooperate with his neighbors and had some altercations. That has changed. And that has brought together Kazakhstan, right? So the most fruitful cooperation that one can expect probably Kyrgyzstan. It's there. I mean, we have seen the 3 countries have reached an agreement to build a hydroelectric power plant in Kyrgyzstan, which was quite controversial in the past, but now they want to go. Also, longer term, they're not just focused on their own personal problems between which would be mostly the case in the 90s and early 2000s. So there's some cooperation, that's for sure, encouraged by Uzbekistan, like I mentioned, but involved well, positive neutrality. So they're more isolated. And then you Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the border conflict, the last that questions any more at the bilateral level. It's going to happen between Uzbekistan and other countries. Kazakhstan also importantly there, but I mean there's still a long way to go. It's positive steps have been taken if we compare to the past, but still, I mean, we will need to keep an eye. But certainly there've been developments. Operation. To some extent, it's hard to know if it's encouraged by the war in Ukraine, but it certainly has shifted Russia's attention westward, has focused most of their efforts. So, who knows? Maybe that's played out.
Dear Fran, thank you very much for your insightful comments, and I hope to see you again in our program very soon.
Thank you, Mahammad. Thank you very much.